I think we are recording now. So that's the other thing, is that we'll have the opportunity to share the recording with people if they have to leave halfway through. We'll be sharing this online as well, so we can reach as many people as possible, so we can all learn about the MNO and the history of the MNO.
It says, please record permission from the meeting host.
So I just recorded. It seems to be recording on my end. I was told I'm the only one who can do that because I organized the meeting. So stop and resume recording. So I think we are recording. Excellent. So say hi to Tony for me from Rick, and hello everyone. Hi. So we have this great chat bar on the side, so that's a great place to start your questions. And then if you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and actually activate the video towards the end if we want to go that route. Okay, so if I do mute you, if you're unmuted during the talk, it's just because we can hear the background noise, so we don't want too much feedback. So again, thank you very much, Tony, for agreeing to do this, whether we were doing it in the normal format or this way. We are really grateful for you to share your knowledge. You are a great historian of all things Métis and a lot of Aboriginal history in Canada. So we're really lucky to hear from you today. And hopefully this can start a conversation and we can all build on what we're learning here today. And maybe we can do this again in the future on the Laurentian campus. Maybe we could do it in person one day. That would be great.
Yeah.
So really grateful for your time. And we're all looking forward to hearing everything that you have to offer. So the questions that we outlined today is really looking at the origin and the history of the MNO, how it came about, why it came about. And I'm curious, and I'd like to know about your involvement in things like the Powley case or the Constitution Act. So there's a lot of history that we can cover. So I'm going to let you take the lead and tell us the story of all of this, the political side, the identity side, the cultural side, so every aspect of what it means to be a Métis person in Ontario.
Well, thanks, Emily, and thanks to you and Laurentian for arranging this. I think the place to start is with the situation of the Métis people back in the 60s and early 70s. There were only 3 Métis organizations in existence in the 60s, and they were on the prairies, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And I happened to become the vice president of the Métis Association in Alberta in the 60s. One of my main concerns was that there was no way to address the issues of land with the Alberta government. I knew that we had to have a presence in Ottawa if we were ever going to address those issues. And on this, another point was that the federal government had programs and services for First Nations, but they weren't making them available to the Métis people. Our people in the 60s were desperate for housing, they were desperate for healthcare and education, and any kind of opportunity for employment. So I said to the other leaders that were there at the time, well, to Stan Daniels, who was president of the Métis Association of Alberta, I said, Stan, let's get the leaders together and talk about this, and we did. And at the time in British Columbia, there was another organization starting there called the BC Association of Non-Status Indians, who were also going to represent the Métis people in that province. So we got together there in 1970. We decided to form a committee and look at things, and we decided in April of the following year to formally form the Native Council of Canada to represent Métis and non-status Indians, to lobby for the recognition of the Métis people to begin with, and also the issues that non-status Indians were dealing with, to get the federal government's attention to these and to address them. we were pretty successful. Well, to start off, when I first came to Ottawa, there was um, just blank stares when you talk about the Métis people. The people in Ottawa, all the members of Parliament, senior government officials, sort of figured that the Métis had disappeared with the hanging of Louis Riel. And they put their foot down right away and said that the Métis, well, you're not federal responsibility, you go see the provinces. So we became a political football right off the bat. The federal government didn't want Métis to be recognized. They didn't want First Nations to meet with us, to recognize us. I finally arranged a meeting with George Manuel, the president of the Métis, of the National Indian Brotherhood. And we went for coffee, and George said, you know, the chiefs don't want me to meet with you, Tony. The federal government doesn't want me to meet with you. They say, look, there's only a loaf of bread here, George, and if the Métis get recognized, they're going to take some of that bread away from you. And I said, George, Ottawa is not a loaf of bread. Ottawa is a bakery. We are not getting access to other things that Canadians are getting access to through all the other federal departments, through Health Canada, through regional economic expansion, and so on. So let's get together and fight Ottawa for total recognition. And I said, Métis people have absolutely no interest in coming under Indian affairs. They have no interest in that. They have no interest in dipping into the programs that are set aside for First Nations. There isn't even enough money there to cover your needs. So we certainly don't want to do that. Federal government's got to make additional funding available for the Métis people. Well, the first issue was getting the federal government to recognize us, and they just absolutely wouldn't. We took the position that the federal government had responsibility for us through the British North America Act, Section 91, which sets out the federal powers of legislation. And under Section 91, there's a subclause number 24, and it says, Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And we took the position that we were Indians within the meaning of that act, or of the Constitution, not the meaning of the Indian Affairs Act, which Indian Affairs just decided who was going to be an Indian, which is ridiculous. We said, no, we come under the Constitution, and you have a responsibility for us. And also in the 1930s, the Quebec government took the federal government to court to say that the Inuit in the northern part of Quebec were federal responsibility because they were like the Indians. And the Supreme Court of Canada agreed. And ever since then, the federal government had responsibility, took responsibility for dealing with what were called Eskimos. And of course, we now use the term the Inuit. So we argued that, we made that same argument. The federal government just said no. And Jean Chrétien, when he was Minister of Justice in the mid-70s, when Harry Daniels from Alberta succeeded me eventually as president of the Native Council of Canada, Harry insisted on getting a legal opinion from Justice Department, and they put it in writing. Later on, Harry decided to take the federal government to court, and we now have what is called the Daniels case as a result of that. But that's the origination of all of that. The federal government having responsibility for the Métis just as they do for First Nations and the Inuit. We got extremely successful in our lobby in the Constitution Act 1982. In the 1970s, Pierre Trudeau wanted to patriate the Constitution. He wanted Canada to be on its own, not have to be under the Parliament of Great Britain. So he needed support. He desperately needed the support of the Aboriginal peoples. After a lot of lobbying, I won't go into it, and there's a lot of great stuff that went on at the time. The federal government agreed to put a clause in the Constitution to recognize the Treaty on Aboriginal Rights of the Aboriginal Peoples of Canada. Harry Daniels knew that there had to be a clause, a subclause that identified who the Aboriginal peoples were, because he knew that if we weren't specifically mentioned, then the federal government would just turn around later and say, well, you were never mentioned by Aboriginal peoples, we mean the Indians and the Inuit. Harry put his foot down, and at one really important meeting in the House of Commons, joint meeting of the House and Senate looking at the Constitution, Harry slammed the table when Chrétien said, no, we're not going to do it. Harry slammed the table and he said, well, then I mobilized my people. And he got up and he walked out. Chrétien left and came back after a while and he said, where's Harry? I need to talk to him. I have an announcement to make. And he said that, and Harry, they finally found Harry and brought him back. And Chrétien said, I talked to the boss and we've agreed that we're going to add a subclause that says the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized as the Indians, the Inuit, and the Métis. The Indians being a legal term under the Indian Act. We don't use that, nobody does anymore. Well, some people may, but for the most part, everybody's now regarded as First Nations. That was an incredibly important time for us. We had, in the Métis people, finally got recognition in the Constitution of Canada. We thought that was the end of it. Throughout the 1980s, there were these constitutional conferences to define what was in the Constitution under that clause. What did that mean? What were the rights? And it all ended in failure, and it was designed to end in failure, those conferences. And the federal government took the position that, well, because there's a little, I'll back up a little bit, there was a little bit of a nuance put into the Constitution by Peter Lougheed, the Premier of Alberta, when Trudeau was trying to get provincial support. Some provinces were coming on side. There was a holdout, and that was Lougheed in Alberta. And he insisted that the word existing be put in the Constitution. That it didn't just read the Aboriginal treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples are hereby recognized and affirmed. Lougheed wanted the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples are hereby recognized and affirmed. And we then found out why he wanted that to be in there. Because the federal government and the provincial governments all took the position after the Constitution was passed, took the position that, well, your rights are no longer existing. If they're existing, they may be existing in treaties, but other than that, they're not existing. They were extinguished. That was the position that they took. And then our people were then forced to go to court. There was no choice. And the first case was a First Nations case from British Columbia about fishing. Many other cases took place. And they were all related to First Nation. They were First Nation specific. We finally, eventually in the 90s and in the early 2000s, got to the Supreme Court in our case, which was called Powley. And I'll come to that in a minute. Let me back up. In 1971, I came to Ottawa as president of the Native Council of Canada. We then began organizing Métis and non-status Indians in all provinces and the two Northern Territories at the time, NWT and Yukon. in Ontario, there was an organization, a small Métis organization that had formed up in Northwestern Ontario Métis Association, headed by Paddy McGuire and his family and people from around those areas around near Thunder Bay. So that organization in Ontario became the Ontario Métis and Non-Status Indian Association in 1971. We organized a province-wide organization. The purpose, again, of that organization in the 70s was to lobby for the recognition of Métis and non-status Indians. That was in 1971 and throughout the 70s. By the 80s, after the Constitution, we started saying, well, we're recognized. The lobby has been successful. We're recognized. And when we went to meetings of the Ontario Métis and Non-Status Indian Association, there was a big fight amongst the people who came to the meetings about the agenda, because all the First Nations people wanted to talk about was their issues that were important to them, which is getting their status back and their family status back and getting access to all of the provisions that were provided through the Indian Act and through Indian Affairs and so on. The Métis people didn't have that agenda at all. We had our own. So you could see that we've eventually got to the point. Took us a long time. We eventually got to the point in 1993 where we said, look, we're not going, the Métis people said, look, we're not going to be able to achieve our goals of self-determination, self-government, and running our own affairs if we're in a lobby group. And we have to set ourselves up to be able to implement self-determination for the Métis people and the Métis people only. First Nations, you have your own issues and your own agenda. So we said, we want to form our own organization. You can carry on and form your own, dealing with just non-status Indian issues. So in 1993, October 1993, we had already previously in the Ontario organization created a Métis Commission. There were a dozen of us on that commission who were all the Métis board members of OMA. We got on a phone call. We decided to formally organize the Métis Nation of Ontario. We established an interim committee, and then we had our founding delegates conference in Toronto in May of 1994. And when we started, we said to ourselves, we want to be self-governing. So we're not even going to incorporate as an association under the laws of Ontario, because why would we do that if we're self-governing, go to another government to get them to recognize us? So we took that position. We are self-governing. We have our own, we set up our own bylaws and constitution for the Métis Nation. We established what we call the Statement of Prime Purpose, which sets out who we are as a people and what our aspirations are, what our values are as a people. Those are all in the Statement of Prime Purpose, which is kind of like the precursor to what you might have in a constitution. So we did that. We wanted to operate on our own. We went to the governments and we said, all right, we're established now. We want to represent Métis people. We want to be able to access some funding so that we can operate. And we want to be able to access the funding that governments have available for Aboriginal people through education or housing or employment and so on, healthcare. The Ontario government took a position that you're not legally recognized. You have to be incorporated before we can provide funds to you because we can only provide funds to legally organized groups. They took the position that First Nations band councils, even though they're not organized under the Societies Act, quote unquote, they said, well, they're First Nations, they're covered under the Indian Act, so we can deal with them, but we're not going to be able to deal with you. We said, okay, what we'll do is we'll form a secretariat. We will call it the Métis Nation of Ontario Secretariat Incorporated, and have that set aside to be the business arm of the Métis Nation. But we will make our own determinations within the Métis Nation for ourselves as to how we're going to govern ourselves, and not come under the Ontario government doing that. So we formed this secretariat. As soon as we formed the secretariat, the Ontario government took the position, well, you have to be incorporated for 2 years before you'll be entitled to funding. And they're just stiff-arming us. We found out later, a little while later, it didn't take us long, what was really behind all of this. And it goes back to the ingrained systemic racism against the Métis people ever since the Thomas Scott, an Orangeman from Southern Ontario, was executed by Riel's provisional government in 1870. 1871, no, 1870, sorry. The Ontario people in Southern Ontario hated the Métis people. Hated them because they were too French, too Catholic, and too Indian. And that racism, it's just amazing when you go into the archives of Ontario to see how it manifests itself. In 1872, the Ontario legislature passed a bounty of $5,000 on Louis Riel's head in 1872. That was the legislature that did that. And they paid out all the money. And when we equated that in the late 1990s to be valued at around $600,000 in 1990 dollars. That puts up a lot of hatred. So that was their position. We eventually were able to win out. The federal government, to their credit, didn't insist that we wait for 2 years. They started flowing funds to us fairly early on. So we were able to organize and mobilize and get ourselves established. We decided to establish a registry. We said to ourselves, we're not going to have a membership. It's citizens of the Métis Nation, people who belong. We'll register those people who are going to belong. And back in the 1990s, and going back even before that, there was no such thing as determining, well, who is a Métis. We sort of always said to ourselves, well, we know who we are. We know who our communities are, who our people are. We're not going to sit down and write something out. But we found ourselves being forced to have to set out some criteria, at least. And at the very beginning, it was, if you are of Aboriginal ancestry and you can prove it, then that would be what you need to do. And we put together an application form and sent it around right away. That was in 1993, actually. We started right off the bat with this application form. And people started applying in droves. The first community that came on board 100% was the Métis community in Timmins. I'll never forget when they passed that resolution, and do want to thank them for taking that measure to break away from the Ontario lobby group and say, we are going to joined the Métis Nation of Ontario. So that's how that all got started. We established the registry. We also started to establish other things that were going to be fundamental for governance, and that was well, hunting and fishing, harvesting policy, because our people in the northern communities, well, even southern, not just northern communities, our people historically have depended on hunting, fishing, and gathering as a traditional way. People depend on that food. Many families depend on that for their very subsistence to be able to exist. Some people may have, in the wage economy, part-time jobs, seasonal jobs, and so on. And so when hunting, fishing time comes around, they need to gather their food for the winter. So we wanted to say to the government, to everyone, hunting and fishing for food is an established Aboriginal right. It's established by that time had been established by Supreme Court of Canada decisions. We said that applies to the Métis people too. And we're going to issue harvesters certificates to those Métis people who we are certain have all the documentation on our file to prove who they are, their community, and that they're entitled to enjoy this right. And at that time, there were only about, there was less than, or just a little more than 400 of our people in the whole province of Ontario that said that they wanted that harvester certificate to hunt big game, moose or bear. And so that's nothing in terms of the size of the province. Well, the whole province went up in arms. The provincial government went up in arms. Ministry of Natural Resources went up in arms. They got the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters went crazy about this. They were all saying, well, the Métis, if their rights are recognized to hunt and fish, then they're going to wipe out the moose population. You know, you always hear about these crazy estimates about how many Métis people there are. Some people say, well, anybody with Indian blood, speculate, is Métis, therefore they're going to be able to hunt and fish for food. That can be thousands and thousands who go out there, which is all crazy. We established our policy, and I eventually actually went to address the OFA, the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, at their annual meeting. It took me a while to even be able to get that invitation to go there and to explain the reality. The reality is that we, you know, if we got 400 or 500 people that are hunting for moose, and the Ontario government issues 17,000 adult moose tags a year for sports hunters, and an unlimited number of moose tags for calf tags, how can the Métis people be a threat? You know, we won over OFA. That was great. We were able to just win the argument with them, but not with the Ontario government. As we know, in 1993, Steve Powley was charged with illegal hunting of moose, Steve and his son Rod. And they decided they were going to fight this. Steve and Roddy were like many Métis people. They'd hunt at night. They'd go and drag their food out at night. And they'd get caught. Usually, people would go to court. They'd pay a fine, and then they'd go do it again. And Steve said, I'm not going to do that. I'm tired of doing that. I'm not going to do that anymore. Put his moose on top of his truck. He drove it right in front of the M&R, went home, and he was dressing it. And, as to be expected, the M&R showed up, and they confiscated his moose, and they charged him. Now, we knew Steve. Steve, God bless him, was bullheaded. When he got something in his mind, he was going to do it. And we knew that he was charged. If he went to court and he lost in court, he wasn't just going to go pay a fine. If he lost in court, we knew he was going to appeal. And if he lost there, we knew he'd appeal again. And we thought to ourselves, the worst thing in the world is to have bad law on the books for Métis people and their rights. So the Métis Nation of Ontario, right at the beginning, started to get involved and in support of Steve. He needed to have good lawyers. We got the best for him. The firm was Pape and Salter, which was eventually Jean Taillet, who a lot of people know now, had been an articling law student and joined that firm and became Steve's lawyer. We took the obligation on to fund the case because Steve didn't have the money. We promised to that law firm that we would pay their bills. So we did fundraising and so on. We went deeply in debt because of it. But what was the choice? We knew we had to do that, so we did it. We went to the court in late 1990s at this court, the Superior Court in Sault Ste. Marie. And when we got there, we found out the Ontario's position. The Ontario's position was that, number one, Métis never existed in the province. Métis do not exist in the province of Ontario. Métis people never existed in the province of Ontario. If Métis people ever existed in the province of Ontario, then they don't exist anymore. And if Métis people ever existed in the province of Ontario, then they never had rights. They never exercised rights. And even if they did exercise rights, well, those rights were extinguished. And even if the court finds that there were rights, then the Métis people who live today are in no way connected to the communities back in the 1800s that might have had rights. It was just all ludicrous. Well, ludicrous, genocide, to just say Métis people do not exist in our province. It's horrible. As a Métis person, I was, to say upset about it, to say the least. We were very successful at trial. The law firm was fantastic in terms of knowing what we had to do. That law firm, by the way, had gone to court in previous First Nations constitutional rights issues right from the very beginning, and they were successful in all of those First Nations Supreme Court matters they were involved in. They knew what they were doing when it came to constitutional rights of the Aboriginal peoples. Dealing with Métis rights, that had to create some new law, and they were greatly successful in doing that. Well, the Métis people, of course, greatly beholden to Steve and Roddy Powley and their family for what they did for the Métis people everywhere, not just in Ontario, but in Manitoba and in Saskatchewan, in Alberta, in British Columbia, Northwest Territories. Because of the Powley decision, our people everywhere throughout the Métis homeland are now able, one way or another, to be able to enjoy their constitutional rights to hunt and fish for food. And because of that decision, the Métis people are now involved. This has led us eventually to the point we're at now, where the Métis people are, through our organizations, able to be at the table to start discussions on the implementation of our right of self-determination. I think I'll end there and open it up for your comments, Emily, or any questions that you're going to have or others may have. And thanks again for inviting me to do this.
Thank you so much, Tony. That was excellent. There is so much information that you shared with us right there, and I'm not a historian, so a lot of new information for me. And it seems that there's so many organizations to know about, and that transition, that changed their name. So you need a flow chart when it comes down to it to understand the political organizations in general, I think. So thank you for shedding some light on that. That was really great. Lots of good points were made. What I found was interesting is when you were talking about the systematic racism, and you really see that the government had this the goal to really divide and conquer, divide amongst non-status and Métis people, and also dividing within Métis people, and just really not acknowledging the legitimacy of Métis people, right? Saying they did not exist, and always displacing who is supposed to be responsible, whether it's federal or provincial. And then this is what stuck with me, is that you said the Métis people were too French, too Catholic, and too Indian. That's what's going to stick in my head for a little while, I think. So that was the perception in those days, and it still seems to be, some of those are still around. Do you see that the racism has evolved? Is it more adept because now we're using the legal system to really try and break down that racism, but the governments are very stubborn about how they go about that? So how is that racism, systematic racism, being displayed now in the political organization and in the self-government, the self-governance piece?
The
big question.
Well, governments represent people, and they represent the majority, and our people certainly aren't in the majority. The racism that existed back in the 60s and 70s, 80s and 90s hasn't disappeared. I mean, it's still there. It's just not as open anymore as it used to be, but it's still there. Governments are not exactly opening their arms to the Métis people. We've signed, our organizations have signed agreements, and we're going to have to negotiate on the basis of those agreements. Governments are still, in many ways, acting as if they're the ones who are going to decide who the Métis people are, mm-hmm. and who gets to be covered by these agreements. Governments, I've heard the minister herself say that, and so, they're still trying to hold it over us. So it's going to depend really a lot on the strength of our leadership to stand up to the governments and to say, no, you don't decide, we decide. Mm-hmm. We determine who belongs, not you. Mm-hmm. That's got to be our position. And when it comes to the recognition of rights, it also comes to the recognition of our rights to lands, mm-hmm. our rights to lands and resources. Mm-hmm. Well, there's other people out there who are going to say, hey, hold on here. What about my license here to do some mining up there? Or, whatever. Industry wants what they've got, and they want to hang on to it. And they have a lot of power where governments are concerned. Mm-hmm. So we have to be mindful about that. There's also divide and conquer going on. There's not enough discussion between First Nations leaders and Métis leaders to get right to the point. We have shared territory. How are we going to reconcile that between us?
Mm.
And instead, governments are going to some First Nations groups and they're saying, let's make a deal. They're going to some Métis groups saying, let's make a deal. And before you know it, people are saying, hey, they're making a deal over here. What about us? Or how come that they've got that deal? They're going to take away from us.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff is going on. And it's going on because there is no encouragement. There's no push for Métis and First Nations peoples to get together and to reconcile their differences. You know, you talk about reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission did a great job, put out great recommendations about how to deal with reconciliation within Canada with Canadians, but we haven't addressed the issue of reconciliation between our peoples. And so there's division going on there. It's carrying on. The division that I had to deal with, we had to deal with, and we came face to face with in 1993. What is that? How many years ago was that? 27 years ago? It's still there today.
So speaking of the divide, we can see it within who's considered an Métis person within different provinces. So my next question is really, are the Métis people a unified people? Because there seems to be a lot of disconnect and tension between people who identify as Métis, who may be French speaking or English speaking, or people who identify as Métis if they're from the East or from the West. So I'm just looking for your opinion on those kinds of topics when you're looking at, you know, some aspects of lateral violence within Métis nations, or aspects of, you know, who's considered to be legitimate or not. And we see that there's a lot of appropriation happening as well. So I'm curious to know what your perspective is on who is a Métis person at the end of the day, identity, politically, culturally. Who is that person? Is there one group?
Well, your question about division between English-speaking and French-speaking Métis kind of threw me, because I haven't been aware of that, to be honest, not contemporarily. I mean, it existed back in the days of Riel at Red River, the English-speaking Métis who were up, you know, settlers from settlers who came from the Orkney Islands and through there, and the French-speaking Métis in Red River at the time of the big crisis. There was huge division there between those two, but I haven't known of it to be existing today. As for, I think it's got to be clear, there's no, in my opinion, homogeneity, 100% homogeneity within the Métis Nation from one place to another. People at Red River say, well, we're the Métis and the Métis homeland is here and starts here and all the rest of that. Well, I'm from Alberta. I come from Lexington, Alberta. And in our community, the first people to come to our territory were some Mohawks and some French, people with French names. Who knows if they were half-breeds or not. Jacques Lerondel, Ignace Garaguante, Louis Garaguante, Daniel Waniande, Joseph Belcourt. These are my ancestors. They first came to Manitou Sragahin, which is our name for our lake, Spirit Lake, Great Spirit Lake. And there was a priest eventually in the mid-1800s that came out there and said, oh, gee, I've had a vision of St. Anne here. These must be holy waters. And so he created a mission grounds. But prior to that, that was our territory. And we didn't have any connection. We didn't have cell phones. we didn't have computers to connect with the people in Manitoba. We're Métis from there. Tepimsoak, Nehio. We spoke in our language out there. The language they speak in Manitoba is different than ours. It's Soto based, not Cree.
Yeah.
And so even from that point, now in terms of economics, in terms of us being, well, my good friend Paul Chartrand likes to talk about the Métis people as being the buffalo hunting culture. And we are. All of us in the prairies, we're all the same. Whether you're from you're Chipewyan from northern Saskatchewan, or Cree from Alberta, or Soto, or Ojibwa from Belcourt, North Dakota, or Red River, Montana. That was our culture. In Ontario, it was different. It was moose hunting culture, but it was the same thing. Hunting, fishing, gathering, living off the land, having your own laws. Métis on the prairies, with laws of the prairies, were not unlike the laws at Sault Ste. Marie that established how people were going to live amongst themselves and recognize each other's personal home property, that sort of thing. We are the same in that sense, the Métis people everywhere. We come from communities, established communities. And in the case of Sault Ste. Marie, we proved that that community existed not only in 1850, when Robinson first went up there to make the treaty with the full-bloods, but the Métis people who fought in the War of 1812. I mean, we have a history as peoples. We have a history in our communities. We are grounded in our communities. Now, there may have been a time when we didn't see ourselves that way. That's true. We never saw ourselves that way in all the Métis homeland. And I was a national president, I can tell you that, to be a fact. Because we weren't looking at it that way. We were kind of sucked into looking at things the way governments wanted us to look at things. You know, base yourselves on some kind of a race, blood quantum, all that crap.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Instead of us saying to ourselves, hey, we're Métis because of who we are, because of our history, because of our culture, because of our territory, because of our community, because of our laws, our ways of doing things, our ways of interacting with each other and with others. That's the way we look at it now. And so lots of people don't fit in that, or don't see that they fit in that. Well, that's because there's a great misunderstanding, I think, of who the Métis people are.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I'll stop there.
I know we could go on forever on those kinds of topics, so thank you. I think you touched on a lot of really good points, and it comes down to the government basically imposing this colonization. That's what's creating all these disconnects within communities and within provinces or nationally as well, right? So a lot to unpack, so hopefully this can start the conversation. I have a question from Rick Maillard. So I don't know, Rick, if you want to ask yourself. Hi, Rick. We can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay. So the question for Tony, MNC announced yesterday, you know, after their big meeting of who they are, like you were just talking, like, you know, the culture and heritage out west. But now they said they had a clear voice from everybody that was there, that they're going forward to define who they are, but no mention of MNO. And since you were like the founder of MNO, what's your feelings on that? If MNO is not included in that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh, Tanse, Rick, nice to hear you, your voice, and I'm glad to see you're on this. Look, it's not the Métis National Council speaking, it's some people who have no authority who are saying these things. Clem Chartier calls himself the president, but as far as I'm concerned, his time has run out. You can't go by our laws and then just disregard them. Our laws say you're going to have elections ever so often. Our laws say you're going to have meetings to bring the leaders together ever so often. You've ignored these things, Clem Chartier, for over a year, well over a year. And so have you, David Chartrand. You're refusing to call a meeting of the Board of Governors of the Métis National Council because you've even admitted it publicly. I don't want to call a meeting because I know we'll get outvoted. What kind of democracy is that? Ridiculous. The Métis Nation of Ontario is legally a voting member, a full standing member of the Métis National Council, period. Until those laws are changed, that is the fact. And those laws are not going to change. And why should they change? The Métis Nation of Ontario was became a member of the Métis National Council in 1994. A full member, no questions asked. And we've been a member ever since. The Métis Nation of Ontario brought recognition of our rights to all Métis people in the province. Clem Chartier, you're even arguing the benefit of that in cases that you're arguing before the courts. How dare you turn around and say that the Métis Nation of Ontario is not part of the Métis Nation?
So to answer your question, Rick, and I think that we've been receiving a lot of questions from citizens or prior citizens or people who were voting members and are no longer. So I think there's a lot of confusion going on about not just like cultural aspects of who the Métis people are, but the legality of what's going on right now. And so according to you, Tony, there's no legitimate reason that the MNO can be suspended at this point.
No, absolutely no. There's no legitimacy to any claim that the Métis Nation of Ontario is not part of the Métis National Council. Now we'll come back to this business of the Métis, who the Métis are. What's really, really critically important to understand is that communities decide who belongs, not somebody else. So if somebody comes forward and says, I'm a citizen of the Métis community, and here's why, and people are accepted by that community, then they belong. The Métis National Council definition right now requires that you be of blood. Well, what about adopted people? Where does that leave our children who have been adopted? Mm-hmm. It's silly to be following these rules that we set up a while ago when we didn't have our thinking caps on about who we are. When we were, I don't know, somehow caught up into having to deal with who we are through the lens of governance. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's time for us to wake up and let's stop this business, this nonsense, these arguments that are trying to be put up here, that people in Ontario somehow are less Métis than the people in my home community of Segoya Hill. Mm. Let's embrace each other. That's what people were talking about at this recent conference held by the Métis Nation of Ontario, Métis Nation Saskatchewan, and Métis Nation of Alberta. Mm-hmm. We are all together. Let's embrace that. Let's live that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's what I say.
Well, that's great to hear from you, because I think a lot of people definitely agree with you. So it's good to hear from somebody with your expertise. We have a question from Dan Cote. I'm going to unmute you, Dan. Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hi, Tony and everybody. Good morning. Tony, just as a quick thing, I have a card signed by you of my first Métis Nation of Ontario card from 1995, and I still have it, and I'm going to keep it because your signature's on it. That means a lot to me. Thank you. Now, let's just move forward. And I know it's hard to crystal ball, but my question was right now, as you know, it's really nasty in terms of who belongs and who doesn't in Ontario. I'm one of those affected as well as many others. Where do you see it happening? Where do you see it going in 5 to 10 years? Will it reconcile? Will it get better? Will it get worse? More divisions, less divisions?
Thanks, Dan.
I see less divisions, and I'll tell you what, it's because I see it happening now. The fact that Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario are working hand in glove is evidence of how things are working now. We happen to have some people who are being a bit, well, I would say unreasonable. But our people are basically reasonable, kind, and generous people. Once the dialogue takes place between our people, and not just some leaders who want to be dogmatic and decide they want to be like Donald Trump. I can decide everything. Then we're going to see a lot of this division that's there start going away. I think within 5 years, well before 5 years, I think we're going to be at that point, well before 5 years. It's definitely something I pray for, and I have my hopes up about because of what I'm seeing going on right now between the Métis people in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, and all of those silent Métis people in Manitoba who want to be part of this discussion.
Thank you. I have a question because we've been talking all about identity in general and you know, who coming together. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with an author called Daryl Leroux. He's from Sudbury, but he's been doing a lot of research in Quebec and more so out east. And there's been situations where there's clear theft of identity or people claiming Métis identity now when they haven't in the past, based on, let's say, an ancestor, you know, 7 generations prior to, and sometimes not at all. Sometimes there is no ancestor at all. So I'm curious what you think about those kinds of movements of people self-indigenizing, whether it's for First Nations or Métis identity, and also the aspect or the perception that there's no Métis people out east, that doesn't exist in the east of Canada. What are your thoughts on that?
The unfortunate emergence of fake Métis is really not good for anyone. It doesn't really impact the Métis nation greatly. It doesn't like rock us. But it sows confusion in the eyes of the general public. And these claims, as I've said before, you know, many thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are Métis. Everybody in Quebec could become Métis. I mean, then you get all kinds of people that sort of react to that, and they say, well, what's going on here? All these people with all these rights. People don't understand that the rights don't come because somebody stands up and says, I'm Métis. The rights are collective. The rights are the rights of a collective, our communities. Aboriginal rights are not individuals, are not rights set aside for individuals. There are rights set aside for the community. It's the recognition of the existence of a community, the recognition that those communities did exercise rights and they either still have them or they're manifest now in treaties or whatever. Individuals within those communities certainly enjoy the rights of those communities. But Aboriginal rights are the rights of a collective. So this is where it's really confusing for the public at large when other people come along and say, well, thousands of us are Métis, just because we say so. Now, as to Métis organizations in the Maritimes, why they want to adopt the word Métis is up to them, I guess. Why they wouldn't want to associate themselves more with their culture there, Mi'kmaq or Maliseet, for example. Mm-hmm. But that's not for me to decide. That's up for them to decide. As to whether or not they have established communities that currently meet the Supreme Court of Canada's test of whether or not that community has Aboriginal rights, that's up to them. They've got to establish their legitimacy with the people they're going to deal with. And they're not dealing with the Métis Nation of Ontario. They're dealing with the Government of Canada or the provincial government. So again, it doesn't really buttress up to us or impact us. Why people, some Métis people, would want to, I don't know, get up on a soapbox and denounce all of them is beyond me. Just, you know, the people that are don't have any legitimacy are soon found to have none, and that's the end of that. And won't get anywhere.
That's great. I like your perspective there as well. And people have to make their own case for their own communities. I really appreciate how you talk about collective rights and community rights as opposed to individualistic. And I think that that's a big thing that we're seeing in the last few years is people claiming individual Indigenous identities and not really having a community to rely on. And no one is claiming them, you know, community-wise. So I think that's a really great test to see when it comes down to it. From Dan Cote, so he's looking for suggestions on reconciliation. You know, that's a big word. What does it actually mean, and what does it mean for the Métis people? How can we work on this?
Well, for me, the most important aspect of reconciliation is reconciliation with our First Nations cousins, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, people we live nearby, live with. That's the most important thing for me. So that dialogue has to take place, and it can take place in many levels. First of all, encourage our leaders, and I'm certainly encouraging our leaders in the Métis Nation of Ontario to take the initiative. You know, go out there, extend, well, not a hand, well, coronavirus is around, but, you know, your elbow, and say, let's talk. Mutual recognition has to take place that rights exist. First Nations have their rights, and the Métis people have their rights. And I think it's incumbent on First Nations people to accept that, recognize it, and accept it. But I know it will probably take some doing with some First Nations leaders that I'm aware of. But they will speak for everybody. Speak to the leaders, but also at the community level. People within the communities can start doing that amongst themselves. People at the university can start doing that amongst themselves. Colleges, you know, you're together, get together, talk about these things. Recognize that each has their own vested interests and their own rights, and respect it. That's where the reconciliation should begin for me. Then we can start talking about collectively reconciliation with the rest of Canada, because we got a long way to go. You've lost your voice, Emily. You have to unmute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, very good point. So now we have Rick Mayara has another question for you.
It's not a question, it's just in my situation, Tony, you've known me for a long time, and I always fought for Métis rights in our community. Where I stand now with the MNO, I am suspended because I didn't have no representation from the MNO or the MNC because there was no Métis in Ontario, right? And then with the homeland, whatever. So in my case, my genealogy, you have my papers, I sent you my papers. So, you know, we were deemed half-breeds at one time. And then they were, the last thing they told me is my ancestor was born too early in Alberta. Today was Rocky Mountain House. You know all the story. So I went ahead and I started my own organization in the French River area. I don't know if it's a good move or not, but that's why I was suspended. But when I answered, I said, well, I got no representation from nobody. Nobody wants to help me. They didn't do the research from French River because they did the Mattawa, jumped over the French River and went to Killarney. So somebody has to do something. Somebody has to stand up to that. So I will continue my vision, and hopefully it'll get me someplace. I'm in dialects with provincial and federal government. So I don't know, as my elder, I'm asking you, is that a good move?
I'm sorry you did that, Rick. I've never believed that you solve problems by doing it from the outside. For one thing, nobody in the Métis Nation of Ontario can be suspended without with a reason. And one of the reasons you can be suspended is if you belong to another organization. That's clearly in the laws. You can't belong to another organization that may in fact be competing with your own. It's like, you know, you're in a community and all of a sudden you're taking the sides of somebody else. You can't do that. Fight within your own community if you think things are not right within your own community. The business of recognition of the communities at French River and around that whole area, that's still an open book, in my opinion. Nobody shut the door on that. There's a couple of things. One of them is the Métis Nation of Ontario is dealing with, or let's put it a different way. The government of Ontario has said, we now recognize these seven areas of the province of Ontario as being places where those communities have rights that meet the test in the Powley decision. In other words, they have legal rights, according to the government of Ontario. And so that in those territories, there can be recognition of the right to hunt and fish for food. They've said that they're not going to accept, because there is no proof yet that the communities in the French River area meet that same criteria. I'm not current on what research is going on right now within the MNO, but I do know that last time I talked about this to anyone over a year ago, they said they were doing research. and I hope they are. So that's one thing. Recognition of our communities by governments is one thing. Recognition of our communities within the Métis Nation of Ontario is another thing, completely different thing. As I said before, if people come forward and they say, I belong, and you are accepted, then you belong. Excuse me. So right now, for example, there's lots of people who don't have on their file, excuse me, documentation to say that they come from some of these legally recognized communities. That doesn't stop those people from being fully active within the Métis Nation. They can still vote, participate in the events and everything that's going on in the communities. We've got elections coming up in Ontario, early May. Everybody can vote in those. Rick, you'd be able to vote if you hadn't been suspended. So I'm really sorry to see that you've decided to start another organization. That's not the answer. That's not going to, in my opinion, won't get you anywhere. You need the resources and the strength of the Métis Nation of Ontario to sort out the issues that exist for all the people in French River. So I don't know. I don't know if it's too late for you to reconsider, but that's any of my thoughts. Oh, excuse me.
Sorry about that, Tony. So a clarification, you said that non-verified people can participate and vote. So even people who are not officially MNO citizens can still vote in the elections.
No, that's not what I said.
Okay.
MNO citizens can vote in the election. All MNO citizens can vote in the election. Whether or not they can be verified as having come from an established, legally recognized Métis community.
Oh, okay.
All right, ones that are accepted by the government of Ontario.
Okay. Okay. So again, this is an ongoing process, right? So in the next 5 years, who knows what will be, which areas will legally be recognized and which won't, right? So do you foresee that happening, that as we move forward, more and more communities will be recognized? Or is there some kind of limitation? Because there seems to, there's been a big review of who the MNO citizens are. Some people have had cards from the past, but are no longer eligible to vote, from what I understand. I could be wrong. So is that just misunderstandings or misperceptions about this kind of stuff?
I just spoke to a senior person at the Métis Nation of Ontario. If you go on the MNO website, there is a thing called the Métis Nation of Ontario Electoral Code. And it says every MNO citizen in good standing is entitled to vote. And this was ratified at our last General Assembly in 2019. So I just wanted to confirm, has anything changed here, or we got any hidden policies going on? No, absolutely, it is what it is. Every citizen of the MNO in good standing is entitled to vote.
And what do you mean by in good standing? What is that really? What are the qualifiers to make you someone who's in good standing? Because lots of people have cards, older cards, so there's uncertainty.
No, it's got nothing to do with it. It's whether or not, for example, in the case of Rick Mayer, you start another organization, you get a letter that you're suspended, then you're not in good standing.
Okay. Okay. Daniel, would you want to ask your question? Not sure if you can hear us or not. You're unmuted. No. Okay. So why is it that why is Rick Mayer why is that not the way to start an organization? So So if I understand, so when Rick separated from the MNO, or when he created his own organization, that's why he was suspended by the MNO. And so from your understanding, a competing organization will not accomplish as much as the MNO? Because because of the relationship with the government, or the backing of a community? This is a question from Daniel.
I've started 2 organizations that ended up being pretty major organizations. I want to tell you that it's difficult when you start. If you don't have anything, you don't have any resources. If I understand Rick and those that may have joined with him, is they want some kind of recognition of their communities having rights to hunt and fish for food. Well, you're up against the 8 ball if you want to try to do that from on your own, starting on your own. Work within the Métis Nation of Ontario to get it done. The MNO's got these kinds of resources. And now with these discussions going on in terms of self-government, the Métis Nation of Ontario's got even more resources. There's another thing. The leadership of the Métis Nation of Ontario can't obviously be dealing with every single issue all the time and putting it top of their agenda. There are some outstanding things from the Powley case that need to be addressed. One of them is mobility of the right. Right now, the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized that the rights exist in a community. The community has the rights, and the citizens can enjoy it. Well, if somebody from Alberta moves out, or somebody from Ontario moves out to now to Sagaya, and our people out there say, yeah, you're welcome here, you can enjoy our resources too. That's their decision. Mm-hmm. But the Supreme Court doesn't recognize that mobility of the right yet. That's one thing that needs to be addressed. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court has established an onus upon an individual to prove they have a right. That's absolutely wrong. It's unconstitutional to have that. Well, the Métis Nation of Ontario, Métis National Council ought to be fighting in the Supreme Court of Canada on that. For some reason, I don't know why, and maybe it's a question of resources, it's not there. The other thing is, the Supreme Court said that if there is a question as to whether or not rights exist, then the onus is on the government to prove that it doesn't exist. The onus isn't on the community to prove it exists. Mm. So why isn't the MNO doing something about that? So people in the communities need to know these things, and they need to demand their leadership to deal with them. I mean, I'm just an individual. I can write my letters and I can talk to people, but I'm just an individual. I'm one person. I do that. People out in the communities there, get up in arms and do that stuff. Mm-hmm. Demand these things of the leadership, and they're not going to ignore you. And we've got elections coming up. Ask the questions of these candidates. What do you think about these things? Are you going to do anything about it? So there's outstanding issues that MNO has to deal with, and they directly bear on Rick Mayer and his community and people in those areas. So it's up to MNO to solve these things. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Starting another organization is futile. In my opinion, I think it's futile. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think that's it seems to be a very relevant question around this, you know, the Sudbury Nipissing area in general, because there's, you know, a lot of misunderstandings about everything that we've covered here today. And then when the MNO does not necessarily, they're not defending the rights or are going after those kinds of situations like, you know, the French River area, then, you know, people feel a little bit dispossessed, I think. And so I think you've offered a lot of clarity on a lot of issues today. I'll probably have more questions tomorrow, but.
I did want to just elaborate on something here. And I think it's sort of it's a parallel thing with the MNO and the Manitoba Métis Federation, or the leaders rather of the MMF, or the leader of, and this whole business of governments not recognizing, or MNO itself not doing something about, or able to do it, maybe something about things that are outstanding with our people and our communities. I said that before. We got to have our thinking caps on, from looking at the lens as Métis people and from our own communities, and not from the outside. It's up to us to decide, and not for the outside. So here you've got David Chartrand, of all guys, of all people, up on a pedestal, ranting and raving about the Métis people in Ontario, Métis Nation of Ontario. We're going to swamp the Métis Nation entirely because we're going to have thousands and thousands of people come and join the Métis Nation of Ontario. He knows that's not true. That is absolutely false, and he knows it. But I want to remind David that a few years ago, and I can't remember when it was, I think it was in the late 1990s, he put out a challenge. We were having a national assembly, no, Manitoba Métis Federation was having assembly, and he put out a challenge to the presidents of the organizations: bring your best fiddlers, we're going to have a fiddle challenge. And my fiddlers in Manitoba are going to wipe everybody out. So I took 2 people. Every other president took someone or 2. I took Roger Giroux, Roger Giroux, whose ancestry originates actually in Shugunda, or he lived down there, and he was married to, anyway, Roger. Not the Dodger, but Roger Giroux, the fiddler. And his nephew, Gilles. I took the 2 of them out there. And the way you judge fiddling is not by looking at the people. You put them behind a screen. Nobody knows who's gone behind that screen. You don't know who's gone behind that screen. And so the judges are listening to these fiddlers, and they are basing their decision on the music that they're hearing. Who are the best fiddlers? Well, who came in number 1 and number 2? Roger, oh, not number 1 and 2, 1 and 3. Roger and Gilles. The guy who came in number 2 was from the Northwest Territories. Manitoba never even showed up in the top 3 of who were the best fiddlers. So give me a break. We're going to be talking about Métis people who have history and culture and all the rest of that. And our best judges in Manitoba chose our people from Ontario. What the heck does that tell you? We got to be thinking about these things. These are the important things we got to be thinking about. Our people, our culture, our history, our ties that bind. And I haven't even gone into the business of the ties that bind from our people who have moved out to Manitoba and the Red River or Turtle Mountains that straddle the border between Manitoba and North Dakota. Mm-hmm. We have a common history with bloodlines, actually, from our communities here and the people who are out in Manitoba. Mm-hmm. We should be talking about these things. be learning from one another. We should embracing our history, our culture, and embracing it and celebrating it together. That's what I hope is going to happen in the future.
Thank you. I think we all definitely all agree. So I think just one last short comment from Rick. If anybody else has a question, just line up, and then we can see if anybody else wants to ask you something. Rick, may I?
Yeah, I just want to make a little comment, Tony. Like, we worked together for a long time. You listened, we argued, you know, but we're real good friends. And I only had one family, it was the M&O family. But since I've been denied, and with different, you know, papers to show, and still, because I don't have that specific word, Métis, I have Sauvage from Rocky Mountain House, 1808. They say that's too early. And because she married a voyageur, a prévôt, went to Quebec, and then the States and all that, it's outside the homeland. And I kept asking for the French River research, because at the time, they had the money to do it. And I talked with 3 meetings with David Zimmer at the time. And the final thing, he says, they dropped the second phase because they used the money, reapplied to go to Kenora and Rainy River to get more meat, Western Métis over there. So I've been fighting for this for lots of years. So I got no choice. I think I'm like a Robert Doucette out west. Like, Robert Doucette always fights for Métis across Canada, Eastern or Western. And I was listening to him at the last meeting they had out west, and he was taking literature from Louis Riel, you know, saying that it's the same families. And Louis Riel had his own family living in around Maniwaki area in Quebec. So all that stuff. So I'm doing the same thing that Robert Doucette is doing to his people, and nobody's listening to him neither. So that's why I took that position, because I don't know, I got to do something. I can't just lay it down. Like Dave Chartrand says, M&O is the only organization that has 3 types of Métis in there. You got the Métis that was born and raised out west with no rights, the same in Ontario. Then you got your right-bearing Métis that's with the communities, they have harvesting rights. And then you got the grandfathers Métis, which have nothing. You know, we still have a voice, like you say, we can still vote and all that. But to me, at a point, I've been with M&O for 25 years. I've been involved with M&O for all kinds of events. They call me, whatever to do, chip, music, all kinds of stuff. But they're not willing to really listen to the people of the French River. We went to like the harvesting when you asked us to go with the Lemieux and Lorraine. They won that court case. They helped M&O, you know, build that confidence that we have rights, and we had them for 15 years, stripped away. All kinds of stuff is happening. So to me, my comment is, I think what I believe in is what I believe in, and M&O is not helping me, so I got to go a different route. And thank you for mentioning Roger Giroux, the fiddler, and because as you know, we played lots of music together. Anyway, that's just my final comment. So anyways, thank you. It was nice seeing you on the screen again, Tony, and talking to you, and maybe we'll play music again together at one time.
Well, hang on, Rick. Hang on. So Emily, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. You know, there's been so much that's gone on in the last little while, well, throughout our 27 years in the Métis Nation of Ontario. Lots of things going on, lots of pressures, and we often don't always get a chance to take everything into consideration. From my mind, we're really, really driven by the lawyers, and I wish they'd back off. You know, they've had their say. Lawyers are dealing with the white man's law. That's it. Let them deal with it. They've done it. Let them deal with it. We got to deal with our own. When we started the Métis Nation of Ontario, we said to ourselves, when we started the registry, we said, we're going to apply the universal standard worldwide, recognized by the United Nations, as to how communities are established and who gets to belong. And it's based on two things. Number one, self-identification. Number two, community acceptance. So self-identification by itself doesn't mean anything. There has to be community acceptance. So we put that in as the bedrock basis for the Métis Nation of Ontario's registry. And we said at the time, we don't have any money to deal with this whole question of community acceptance. How do we get to do that? So we set up a registry with a registrar to be a temporary, as a temporary thing. Hello, am I still on?
Yes, you are.
Emily?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. We can hear you.
Oh, okay. We set the registry up to be an interim registry. So we created a position of the registrar and gave that registrar criteria to follow as to who could get registered. And that has, admittedly, that's changed over time. But we established it, so everybody who was registered all along the way is registered. We said there will come a time when we can deal with the whole business of community acceptance. And that is the time at which we then come back to all of these issues as to who belongs. It's not going to be a registrar that's going to make that decision. It's going to be through a community acceptance process. We define what that process is going to be. Is it going to be at the community level? Will it be regional? Will there be committees of elders? Who knows? We have to have that discussion. That's got to be on the books. That's part of what we're dealing with in terms of going forward on Métis self-government. We have to establish those laws before we can go forward to the government to say we want to have them recognize our self-government laws. We have to do that. So it's still outstanding as to how we're going to deal with these things. Remember, it's self-identification and it's community acceptance. We are going to have to deal with the whole question of community acceptance. As a people, collectively, we've got to decide how we're going to do that. So the book's still open on this, Rick. And to anybody else who might be feeling somehow that they're not going to be recognized. It's up to the communities to make this decision. It's up to the community of the Métis Nation as a whole to make this decision. And we're nowhere near that. Haven't even opened the topic of it yet. Mm-hmm. But it's obviously an urgent thing to do. And it's, again, one of those questions you want to ask the candidates coming up for election. Candidates not only for president, but also for community regional councillors. They're really important. They make decisions too, the PCMNO. Mm-hmm. So that's, I just wish people would, be patient. In some cases, patience is required. Meanwhile, you're not going to lose your rights. All rights to vote, to participate fully. And then just, let's all put pressure on the leadership to make sure they start addressing these urgent matters.
Mm. So it really comes down to reconciliation, like you were talking earlier, right? So we need to come together as communities to drive that change. Individualistic kind of approach is not going to work. It's not going to do much. And I think in general, reconciliation, I really appreciated how you touched on reconciliation in lots of different ways within Métis communities, within the Métis Nation, with Métis people and First Nations people. So I think that, you know, you talked a lot about that kind of collaboration, and stop dictating who people are based on the government's idea of who they are, right? That's the other one that we seem to forget a lot, is that we're letting the government lead us in identifying ourselves and our communities. So thanks for that. I appreciated that very much. Last chance for anyone who has a comment. Dan Coste says, thank you, merci, thank you very much, Tony, for coming with us today. I think we can all say that we really appreciated the talk today. I'm going to be thinking about this for a little while, and I think I'm going to have more questions for next time. I hope that we could do this again at some other point, Tony, maybe through Zoom again. It's a good format, lots of great questions. But I hope that we could also do a large gathering where we could come together and eat some food together and maybe hear some music.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, again, thank you very much. And if you have any last words for us before we go.
No, I just want to say thanks to you and thanks to Laurentian for putting this on. And I'm glad you're taping it. It's recorded, and other people who haven't had a chance to tune in might be able to get to see it if they want.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely use this as a teaching tool. It's a great exercise. And again, on campus, like you said, we need to have those conversations on campus and in our community in Sudbury. And then we can, you know, maybe gain some momentum and have some understanding and come together a little bit better. So I look forward to sharing this video with lots of people.
Okay.
And you're asked to play the guitar next time. That's in the background. I hope I didn't interrupt you.
All right.
Well, thanks
Right.
again, Tony. I hope that you have a good couple of weeks and you get to enjoy the golf course.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay, bye.